peanut butter.
This meeting is being recorded.
As I just took a bite. Okay, thank you, Tony. Professor, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you remotely when you were here in my home last week with Tony. It was just fun to make you both breakfast, so thank you for that.
Yeah, you're a great cook, even if you do rinse your dishes, which I disagree with fundamentally.
What, is that bad for the water or the environment or something?
We don't need to if you're putting them in a dishwasher.
I have a really nice dishwasher too, but have you ever had to put your fingers in the gunk at the bottom of the dishwasher because it all gets gunked up?
No.
And neither have I, but that's why, because I rinse them.
Oh, I don't. Yeah, I don't do that, and I don't rinse my.
Right. Hey, before we get to a very serious subject, what do you think about new do? It's like I don't have any hair left. It's like I'm in the army again.
Yeah,
looks good. Looks like you're ready for spring.
Yeah, it is a spring haircut, but my God, I just don't have any hair, even before I cut it. But anyway,
and good luck today finding spring in Colorado, Mr. Braxton.
Oh yeah, it's pretty chilly. We're gonna get some snow probably, but that's good. We need the water. We need some of California's water. All right, so Professor, I've got a topic that we have hinted on and talked about for over 2 years now, and I'm hoping we're going to go a little bit closer to the edge of actually talking about the truth. Not that we haven't been talking about the truth for 2 years, but let me give you 2 or 3 different scenarios that are not bothering me. I'm not staying awake at night worrying about it, but it bothers me. What is truth and how do we know? So let me give you 2 or 3. I have given many speeches about, I'm going to give you one level of the truth because there's 40 people in the room here. And I'm going to give you less value because several of you are recording this speech. If it was a private conversation among 30 or 40, I'd feel a little bit more. Now, if any of you want to know the real truth or some inside nuances, we probably have to follow up one-on-one in an individual meeting later. And I actually think that's ethical. Because I'm not going to reveal to a bunch of strangers on the interweb some inner working of a client or a process or a campaign or a public policy issue that some enemy of mine is going to use it to hurt me in my real life or real job or real effort. I'm presenting the facts in as rational way to that group as I ethically can. It's being recorded. Okay, I'm going to have to be careful of my words. I don't want to curse, for example. I don't want to have it, give a fact that I'm not positive of, where I'd probably give a cite if it wasn't being recorded. But if it's being recorded, well, I don't want to look dumb by having the wrong number of deaths or states that agree or disagree, etc. Now, that's one scenario. A gentleman that I really admire, Gary Vaynerchuk, I think is how you pronounce his name. He made his money in the liquor store business back east somewhere, and then he became a keynote speaker and a social media guru. He's really actually pretty cool. I've met him in person at a major conference and went up and shook his hand. He did a blog post today, or maybe it was a Facebook thing, that said, hey, AI is changing the world. It is amazing. You want to get a good job? You want to be an expert in your field? Then tell ChatGPT. This is almost a direct quote. I was going to pull it up. I guess this is being recorded to the world, and hopefully Gary will hear this and go, I didn't exactly say that, John. But it was to the effect of this that said, impress your future employers or your clients by just telling GPT whatever your field of expertise is. Hey, ChatGPT, give me all the information about this project or this scenario, and it'll give you a excellent 1-pager if you tell it to, or a 3-pager, and then put that on your internet as you. And I was just so shocked. I'm so stunned by saying that that's you. You're now an expert in your field because you're asking a question of ChatGPT and then presenting that as yourself for a job. Really? So I'll save the others for conversation because I'm talking too long. But I have this, and I want to go deep, by the way. I want to talk religion, and I want to talk deep philosophical things, not what you and Tony and I talked about when we were making breakfast together. I don't think that's his business. That's the 3 of our business last week. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I kind of mean by the truth. Am I willing to chat about all sorts of stuff to all sorts of people who I semi-trust? Of course I am. I like people and I like controversy and I like argument. I like discussions. But I don't want to get beat up over it. I don't want to get humiliated. I don't want to lose my marriage or my home or my business because I'm willing to be authentic with someone. And so what I'm trying to articulate, Professor, is a unease about the truth. That there's everybody in society, I think, has some version of unease about this. Okay, I will give the third. I get internet requests every day. Yeah, hey, your quarterly statement. I just got it like 5 minutes before I signed on. Your quarterly statement is reportable. John, take a look at it and see if it and I want to look at it because I'm going, well, is this an investment account or is this something Meredith has done? And I want to click on it. And I'm telling you, I hardly click on anything anymore. I mean, I just think it's all a scam. I think there is no truth out there on the internet. I don't want to click on it because I don't want to get a virus or I don't want to get my account information stolen. I figure if it's really important, they're going to send me a letter or they're going to knock on my door. I don't know. There's some way that I'm going to get the truth eventually because they're going to send me a letter and then I'm going to call their 800 number or something. So anyway, I think more and more of us are getting disillusioned with facts or disillusioned with people or and we just don't know what's real, what's the truth. I've talked too long. Give me a quick response to this and then I'll ask follow-up questions.
Well, I think you've got a sort of let's try and put it into buckets if we can. The first one is
and with a historical approach because you are a history professor.
Yeah. So the first bucket I would say is does absolute truth exist and why do we think it does or does not? And
Excellent.
Then the second question we might want to approach is, if truth does exist, how do human beings experience it? And then the third bucket would be, how do human beings want to communicate it to one another? Because in a way, those are all three different issues. And I think you've kind of touched upon each one. You want me to go?
These are why I'm asking you. So you're categorizing them very thoughtfully. I'm willing to listen and shut up for 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, so I can give you like my quick answer for each of those three buckets if somebody, because who knows if I'll remember what bucket number 3 was in 2 minutes. But,
sure.
But I think the first one was like, does absolute truth exist? And I struggled with this for years. And eventually I settled on truth, beauty, and love as at least examples that, and then you could sort of add things like abstractions and evil also into evidence that there is a truth. I think about things, people saying like Abraham Lincoln saying, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. And you have to sort of tell yourself, like, is there some way that we know that slavery is wrong? And if you think that there's some way that we can say something like slavery is wrong, then you believe that truth exists. You believe in objective, that there is some sort of an arbiter or a truth that exists outside of the human experience. In other words, somebody has asked you the question, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? And you've already answered that by saying, yes, it makes a sound and there's no one there to hear it. So if you believe that you can make a statement like the Holocaust happened or slavery is wrong, that means that you're making a moral judgment and saying that this is wrong. And this is wrong whether or not anybody ever knows about it, whether anybody forgets it, whether, in other words, you're saying like if somebody commits a murder and you get away with it, then was the person really murdered? And if you're and if you can come back and say, yes, that person was murdered, then you believe that truth exists. And then there are these other things that are maybe more pleasant ways of getting at why we would believe that truth exists. And that is that as human beings, we're capable of experiencing the abstract, which, in other words, we can come up with abstract concepts that have a practical application in the real world. So, in other words, we can abstractly think about the fact that a a line is the shortest distance between 2 points, even though in the real world, there's no such thing as points and there's no such thing as a line. But we can then use this abstraction of perfection that then we can translate into something practical in the real world. So some people would say truth exists because of that. Other people would say, well, because we can experience beauty and because we can experience love. And these are all things that seem to indicate that there's something beyond the human experience, right? Not just physics, but that there's something called metaphysics out there. Happy to, go down that path and talk about all those implications if you want. Then,
Well, so should I interrupt you now, or are you going to go to your second point and I'll interrupt you after all 3 points?
well, it's up to you. You can either interrupt me now, or I can go to my second point.
Well, let me just do a nuance then, since I've
Okay.
already interrupted you.
Yeah.
We used to say it in black and white, but now some people say we shouldn't even use black and white because it's not politically correct. I actually get that in a way. But you said, I was trying to translate your comments. Does absolute truth exist? You put yourself in the yes category. I heard you. You gave a bunch of different scenarios, and you're a yes.
Yep. I
And
know I love
am-
my kids. I know the Holocaust
Yeah.
happened. I know slavery is wrong.
And I agree with all those. I love my kids too. I assume you love your kids, so I assume that's the truth. But part of my intellectual being says, well, yeah, but there's some nuances to even that. And so in current debate in slavery, yes, that is an absolute truth. But in many state statutes, slavery still exists as an exception to the Constitution, except in criminal act. If you're in jail, you can force people to work. And they're trying to get rid of those codes because it implies that you should never have slavery. I get it. And also, my first ancestor, unless I'm completely wrong, my version of the truth through many generations of Brackneys is my very first ancestor came here as a bond slave. I think it's more accurate to say indentured servant, but 7 years for the cost of the ship, and he had to work 7 years of his life, and that's how he came to America. And I actually think that's probably a pretty neat thing. And he wanted to get out of England, and cool, it's a pretty expensive boat ride, but that's what he needed to have since he didn't have any money. So here we are, and there's a bunch of Brackneys throughout America now. But I'm sure we're not talking about indentured servants or prison when we say that truth. So it's not a shades of gray, or is it?
It's not. No, I'm saying when I say slavery, I mean it is morally wrong, and wrong in every sense of the word, to ever pretend that a human being is less than human or anything
Okay.
other than human.
You can force him to work in prison, but that's
Yeah.
not slavery.
Right.
You can have a lousy boat ride over for 7 years of your life, but that's not slavery.
Right.
Okay. So
You're
you're
not
a right
denying
and
the
wrong.
nature of man. Yeah.
Yeah, you're a right and wrong, black and white, truth and falsity, not a shades of gray person.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I believe in complexity, but I also think that a lot of errors that we make and what other people would call nuance is almost always just a lack of, not just a lack, but maybe just categorical errors and not defining your terms. So
Okay.
that's why I
Cool.
think usually if we just define our terms, we can get to the heart of the matter a little quicker.
Okay. You've given me enough for now. Remind me, though, after you give your next two, that I'd like to talk religion, even my personal religion, even with the knowledge that this video, once it's on the website, might hurt me professionally or personally. So I'd like to consider that based on how you proceed with the next two. Go ahead,
Well,
Professor.
I would just say I'm happy to talk about religion, because really working through my belief in objective truth was a big part of my religious and faith journey, and it remains a big. And my understanding of truth is also deeply enmeshed in my religious faith. They interact with one another constantly. So the next part of it, I think, let's see, I said, so it was, does absolute truth exist was the first bucket. And then the second bucket was, how do human beings experience truth? And because of our permanently flawed moral nature, and our permanently flawed nature in general, right? Our imperfect brains and the imperfect way in which we perceive the world and other people, we will never and can never experience the totality of absolute truth as human beings. It is beyond what any human being can know or experience. How human beings experience the truth is fragmentary. It's momentary. My favorite political philosopher who described this for me was Isaiah Berlin, who used this metaphor of a fish swimming in the Mississippi River. I'm sure I've mentioned it before because I love this metaphor. But a fish swimming in the Mississippi River, you can't say that you don't have any indication that there is a current, right? You know that the water is flowing in a certain direction. That's how human beings experience the truth. But you're just a fish, and you don't know if you're at the top of the Mississippi River or the bottom. You don't know if the river is facing north, south, east, west, or if it's pointing directly at where you'll eventually end up in New Orleans. So you might be headed to the right, you might be headed to the left, you might be headed up, you might be headed down, you might be pointed in the direction you're going to eventually go. But that is how a human being experiences the truth. It's not that we can't know anything about the truth. It's that we can only know some things, and thus the way that we should approach life and truth is with humility. So I'd say that's bucket number 2, how human beings experience the truth. And then the third bucket was, what does that mean for how we deal with one another? And I guess the first piece of it would be with humility, and hopefully grace and kindness and meekness and generosity, liberality. And but I think that there's also, in a way, I don't know if you want to call this proof that truth exists or something, but and this is something that occurred to me after I left your house, by the way, on my long, this is a lot of time on a bike. A lot of time on a bike, right? Yeah. And so I was thinking about the nature of language, and I was listening to a podcast about reading and the science of reading and what reading is within brain function. And just as an aside, one of these scientists compared reading to language and said, what's really remarkable, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing, and I'm saying, one of the things I hadn't really thought about is that reading is essentially an unnatural act. That you have to be it's not unnatural, but it's something that human beings have to be taught how to do, right? Sure. You have to be able to sound out words, then you have to be able to understand what those words mean and put them into context. And that's something that you cannot do unless you are taught. But for the purposes of our conversation, this is what I find interesting. You don't have to teach someone language. We are born with the ability to communicate with one another. And so that means that communicating with one another is natural. It is something that you are simply born with. You're born with the ability to understand and learn language because our brains evolved. We have parts of our brains that just will automatically understand language. You don't have to be taught.
Now, Professor, I guess I got to interrupt you because that doesn't sound like the truth to me.
Okay.
I thought from the earliest memories, whether it's it was after the 80s. I didn't get this from my mom, but I was the 5th kid. But after I was born and growing up, they used to play classical music while you were in the womb because you could, have the feeling of the sound or whatever. But then from earliest efforts of holding your child to, first eating, you were taught how to communicate from your mom and dad and interactions, touch. You're constantly taught how to communicate. It's not a natural thing. It would be not too dissimilar to reading. I would actually argue on that side rather than your premise just now. Where am I wrong?
I'm glad you asked, because we're not disagreeing. It's that you don't have to break the act of understanding language down into steps. You don't have to teach it in a specific order in order for people to understand it, right? A baby being born and living around his mom is going to learn, just obviously the mom is going to be speaking to the baby, and the dad, and right. All of that is teaching, but you don't have to, there's no level of abstraction that is not inherent to the brain that needs to be overcome.
So there was a word, I don't have a teaching degree. There was a word, it's not tautology. It's how teachers teach. There's a method of teaching. Is that similar to what I forget the word. You know what I'm talking about?
I don't know what you're referring to.
It's the reason, pedagogy, I think. It's the reason some teachers don't think I could teach as well as they can, because there's a science to teaching.
Is it a tautology? Is that what you're trying to get to? Tautology?
No, it's not tautology. I think it's pedagogy.
Right. Well, but here's the thing, there is a science behind how the human brain functions, and how the human brain does different things. So one of the things that I don't want to get off on this topic, but one of the things that I was talking about with one of my colleagues is, just because it's the only way to teach someone how to read. So it turns out there's only one way to teach someone how to read.
I thought there was 2 ways.
No, you have to do this thing in a very specific order. First, you must learn how to sound out words, and that must take place, and it must take place first. And then the second part is you must learn context, because of how the human brain processes what words are, is essentially as a memory, and a memory is a story we tell ourselves, and a word means something to you because of all the times that you've seen that word being used, and essentially you're building up memories of this word being used. And if you don't do either of these things, if you don't know how to sound out words and you don't have any context, you're not reading. But it has to happen in this specific order. However, that process is not the same for almost anything else that a human being learns. So it's also a flaw for people to say, well, if this is how human beings learn how to read, then this is how they must learn how to practice law or do history or air conditioning repair. It's simply not true. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not, but I do find all of that interesting as a teacher to know that there's a brain science of teaching and learning that tells us, well, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. Anyway,
back to the truth. So, Professor,
subject for another day. But the final bucket was how do we communicate with one another, and the way that we communicate with one another is by putting the truth into context. And there are a lot of moral decisions that we make when we want to put a truth into context. And because communication is by nature a social thing, right? It involves not just one person, it involves either. So as I'm sitting here, I'm speaking to you, I'm not necessarily giving you the truth. I'm constantly making moral decisions about what's the best way to communicate to you specifically, but I'm also in the back of my mind thinking I'm also communicating to Bart and Jake and Anthony, right? But I'm also thinking about, well, would this make sense to an even broader audience beyond Bart and Jake and Anthony, because this is something that's going to be up on the internet, right? And this might be something that after I'm dead, my grandkids will want to listen to. So I'm also communicating with them, right? And so every form of communication that a human being is taking part in is social. So in a way, it's not, our relationship to truth is not unlike many other things that we encounter in life. We begin by saying there's a lot of evidence that it exists. Then we're confronted with the fact that we don't get to ever have a perfect answer about it. And how we communicate with others, the thing goes from being individual to being social, and everything gets even more complicated. And what you hope is that, and maybe, I guess I'd just say, let me make this only about myself, and say, what I hope about myself is that I've learned and continue to improve on this, is that, humility and grace are probably, should be the order of the day.
All right, let me ask the question on that, since that's a nice, powerful statement. The truth is, in 2023, in the United States, in politics, I suggest in business, I'm not sure I'd go to religion, but in politics and business, I'm not sure I'd go to neighborhoods or families. But in politics and business, and maybe some others, truth isn't decided by humility and grace and love and forgiveness and pluralism. We're not rewarding that behavior right now. We want cutthroat, brutal, my burger is best, or this beer is better, and your politics sucks, or the Supreme Court said, or no, you're a jerk. I mean, all the stuff, there's very little humility right now, is there? I mean, I guess you and I both know good examples of it, but as far as in general, that's not valued on TV or comedy or movies or elections, is it? Or I know you think it's probably on a pendulum and we'll go back, but right now that's not valuable, is it?
Well, it depends on what you mean by valuable, right? Again, we got to define our terms. It's valuable to me. And it's the thing that I spend a lot of my time working on. When I was young and more blunt, I used to say, every time somebody's raising their voice, the only thing you should be hearing is, my father couldn't show me affection. Right? No matter what the person is actually saying or screaming at you about, it almost doesn't matter. I had a friend get mad at me, or actually, I don't know if he wasn't mad at me, but he was mad while speaking to me. And at the time, because we're friends, my only thought is, I love you. And, you're not, because you are angry, there's probably no point in, disagreeing or trying to interrupt, although I couldn't help myself a few times, because sometimes when somebody is angry and on a roll, what you want to do is say to them something like, not for me, but for you, I'm going to interrupt you right here, because you're a good human being. I know that what you're about to say is something you're going to feel bad about later. So I'm going to just, I'm going to try and redirect you a little bit so that
That's lovely. Did it work in that instance or no?
Yeah, absolutely. And because this is one of my closest friends, and the next day, because he is a good person, he came and spoke to me the next day and said, listen, I just want you to know that I was so angry that none of that was directed at you. And I said, I know. Yeah. But if I was being more sensitive, or if I was being more, maybe if I didn't know him that well, maybe I could have been hurt. I think under most circumstances, a normal person would have been hurt.
Right.
and reacted with hurt. But when it's somebody who you have a really deep friendship for and you have a lot of respect for as a human being, and you know that this person has such a strong sense of morality, right and wrong, and really is just, this is one of the people I would say I'm almost most privileged to know on earth. And so when he gets hot about a topic, like, cut him a wide berth, because he's just really wants to do the right thing, So anyway, and it literally happened to me Wednesday and Thursday of this week, that example.
It's a completely lovely example. So thanks for sharing it. So I've got 4 questions that will conclude my questioning of you today, and then we'll open it up. Each of these 4 questions would probably be a show unto itself, a conversation unto itself. So try to summarize in the spirit of just conversation. I do think you've already given us plenty to hang on to think about how we debate others, how we engage with others. I think anyone that does ever find this conversation, I think will provide some value to them, whether they win the argument or whether they vote for the candidate, or whether they win the trial. It may give them some reflection. And so you've already earned your pay today, Professor. So thank you very much for that.
All right.
So let's go to easiest to broadest. Easiest. I'm a student of yours. I'm not a theory. If I were a student of yours and whatever the question is on the exam, and I turn in a term paper, and I'm not sure whether you can determine whether it's an AI driven answer, but I give a pretty complex 5-pager or 10-pager or whatever you're asking for, but I don't know if you can tell if it's GPT, but the question is, if I could just ask a couple questions and define the parameters of what I want, and I turn that into you for a grade, that's great, isn't it, John? Good job. It's kind of the Socratic method. I was smart enough to ask the internet to give me a good answer, and I gave it to my professor. Hooray, that's the right answer, John. Or no, that is like despicable. That is just like, you haven't learned anything. What's the truth on that? And how do you in the real world, this is the easy question, how do you in the real world handle AI for a grade, which matters for careers? And what are you doing?
I'm saying no, because of the specific skill set that I happen to teach. I'm a history teacher, so the actual specific skill set that I'm trying to teach my students is, how do you take, and just I'll put it in the crudest, shortest way possible. What you do if you're a historian is you take a lot of information, you make it shorter, and you turn it into a story.
Well, but that's what AI does.
Right. But I'm telling you that there is a value to a human being engaging in this process. So in other words, it's like saying, I can pull out my iPhone and take a picture of a tree, but this is an art class where I'm supposed to be teaching you how to paint a tree. Like, you're right. Why should I bother to learn how to paint if I can just take a picture of a tree? Well, the point is that what we're doing is something different. We're creating art. We're what a human being can do. And I'm borrowing this metaphor from Calvin Coolidge, who used this as his example of like, why bother to create art? The point is that what the artist can do is it can create a human context that becomes useful in ways that AI could have never anticipated. AI is extremely good at what we typically would think of as like summarizing stuff, but it's not actually it's not going to be as quirky. And the other thing about
not going to be as what, or maybe you want to intentionally
be as quirky as what a human being would be.
But that's a good thing. Quirkiness is good.
Yes, because there are so many discoveries in history and in the human experience that come from things like that are just accidents. You know, if I hadn't been leaving your house talking about a certain subject, I wouldn't have fired up that specific podcast. And then the way that I'm putting those ideas together is idiosyncratic, right? It is not according to a formula. And then in addition, my goal might be something beyond what anyone has ever done before. You know,
Yeah, Professor, all that resonates with me because I know you and everything I've observed and felt in your environment, electronic or personally, seems to think you're a decent, thoughtful, kind, loving, intellectual, wanting to solve problems, wanting to make a difference, all sorts of positive virtues out in the world. That resonates with me. But there's a lot of people that don't have the brain power or the emotional stability or the experience, and they find the same little oddities, the quirkiness, as you said, and they find conspiracy theories and then throw it up on the web, and then other people, and then next thing there's a whole movement of wackos that thoughtful people can't even debate because it's just so off the wall. At least AI can go through and go, yeah, weirdos, and whoa, education, experience, organizations, recommendations, engaged thoughtfulness. I'm going to value this more. Where humans obviously just have our own biases and we do crazy stuff even though we don't think we're crazy. How do we know we're not crazy? Maybe you and I are the two conspiracy theorists and all the wackadoodles out there are on the right path. How do we know the truth?
I would say, first of all, AI thinks that I am a philosophy professor who lives in Maryland, and I don't.
Okay.
So
Well,
I would say like it's not there yet, but
it's young.
yeah, but it is in its infancy. But the second thing is, let me now defend two things. First of all, let me defend wackadoodles and crazy people and people.
Good for you.
Who are,
Thank you.
you know, one of the things that is truly valuable, and I often say this about a college experience, like a true college experience, and this is why what drives me nuts about people who have a kind of hyper credentialism about all that matters is you get a bachelor's degree, right? And it doesn't matter if you learn anything, just a bachelor's degree. Why is it still valuable to go to a specific place? And why is it better if you have a bunch of professors who actually disagree with one another? You know, I think about we have two fantastic philosophy professors where I teach, and they are very different in their approaches. And I think how blessed our students are that they can take two outstanding philosophy classes and these two guys come at it from completely different perspectives. And the same is true, I would say, of our history department. We have me and you got me and you got two other people, and they're both really good, but they're nothing like me. They don't do anything that I do. But I think that one of the things that human beings really benefit from is that idiosyncratic difference that comes from true diversity. And not, it's far more important to everything that I think really matters about the human experience to value idiosyncratic diversity. And it is important to have wackos. I hate conspiracy theorists as much as the next guy, but I think it's important that they exist because it's important that everybody else has to keep making the argument, because it's the diversity that strengthens the argument. In other words, if I were, and I think about this a lot because one of the things that is really lacking in a lot of educational institutions and in a lot of areas of life is that you don't benefit because you're around a bunch of people who agree with you. And if everyone around you agrees with you, the tendency of any group is just going to be to spiral into radicalism. And then they end up being so wildly lazy in their arguments that the first time they confront anybody, they're weak and flabby and wrong, and and you can see it all the time. I used to say,
Are you describing fish in the Mississippi right now, all over the board?
yeah, but I think I really benefited. All of my professors. I didn't have any conservative professors. Ever. I think my first conservative professor that I had was I had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and I was in the second year of my PhD program before I ever had a single conservative professor. So
I think similar all
yeah,
the way through political science and law school. I think almost all of them were liberal.
yeah. And in your case, you probably went to law school at a time where all of them were living Constitution guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that I benefited from was that in among that mix was that nobody agreed with me. But at least most of my liberal professors were still engaging with conservative arguments, but also leftist arguments, and were familiar with the best arguments of people who disagreed with them, and it benefited everybody. I mean, I've always liked the Eisenhower statement, don't join the book burners, don't be afraid to read everything. And this gets back to our conversation about truth. And again, as all things, get back to Coolidge. Truth and freedom are inseparable. If you actually believe that that the truth of the human experience is that human beings should be free, and that means living at peace and free to pursue their version of happiness. If you really believe in peace and happiness and love, and you believe that is the true nature of humankind, there's nothing that is true that you should ever be afraid of. Because every piece of evidence will eventually lead you to the conclusion that human beings should be able to live lives of peace where they love each other and pursue happiness.
Yeah, sounds like a liberal concept there. And I didn't mean that.
I thought about this as a book title this week. Let me run this by you. I thought about this.
Okay.
All right. How about this? Peace, love, and happiness: a history of American conservatism.
Oh my God! Right from some '60s, Haight-Ashbury or Woodstock.
It would be great, and start with the Puritans, and people would be so confused by the title, right?
Yeah,
it's a book about.
I think you should pursue that, professors. I've been trying to get you to write a book for several years now, so please pursue that.
Maybe we just came up with it right there.
I'm glad we got around to that.
Yeah.
Hey, Tony, not Tony, Jake. I think this is Tony's. Jake, if you can go back 2 or 3 minutes and see if you can do a nice cut quote of that whole part of the conversation from Professor Tootle, I think we should use that from this show. That was really nice. Okay, Professor, that was 1 of 4. And that was the easy one. So I can't submit an AI paper to you, and that's truth. I'm a good student. I can't do that. At least in today's world, that's not good for at least you.
Well, you have not demonstrated learning.
Okay, cool. And you articulated that well. Thank you. So the next one in the scale of easy, crime. Who determines truth in crime in America?
Laws that
right
the social nature.
And who determines those laws of what? And I'm talking crime. Whether an act is a crime or not. Who determines that?
I mean, most of the criminal code is in state laws.
Right. And who determines the state law if somebody committed a crime?
Legislatures and courts.
Courts, and who exactly in the courts determines whether you are no longer free?
Well, you have the option for either a judge or a jury in most cases.
And once the judge or the jury decides that is the truth?
Well, it certainly is the reality.
Right. And so do we, for some reason, argue about this constantly, whether somebody's a murderer or somebody's a criminal, or you see it in the newspapers and social media every day. That person's a murderer. That person's a thief. That person's a dishonest. But I'm not sure we know what those terms mean anymore. But in a criminal way, you finally got there. It's either a judge or a jury determines whether you're a criminal or not, correct? In America in 2023.
Well, they determined that a decision about what will happen to you has been made.
Right, but it's not necessarily the truth. It just determines on that.
And in fact, you can say it, of course, and I'll even make a bolder statement. It will always be wrong. It has to be. It's always the result of flawed human beings enacting a flawed system. So it will never be justice.
Well, that's kind of fine, but when somebody gets murdered, especially a loved one, was OJ a murderer or a criminal or not?
I think so. Yeah.
No, he wasn't. The jury said no, he wasn't.
Well, that doesn't matter. There's a difference. Saying that somebody was murdered and that somebody is a murderer, right? Again, this gets back to my description of objective truth. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer is yes. Whether or not O.J. Simpson was convicted by a jury does not determine whether or not he committed the murder, because there is an objective truth above whether or not the truth is ever recognized by anyone.
So it's really difficult. This is really difficult stuff, isn't it? Because any one of the wackadoodles or thoughtful people can make their own interpretation of whether somebody is a murderer or not. No matter what the jury did, no matter what the legislature did, no matter what the court system said, no matter what the jury did, they can still make their own assumption of what the truth is.
Well, every human being has freedom of conscience. So I don't get to crawl into your brain and dictate how you interpret the world.
Okay. Keep going if you can hear me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, every individual human being has freedom of conscience. So I don't get to go into your brain and determine.
Okay, I did hear that.
Yeah.
Since we're running out of time, I've got to go rapidly, and we may not be able to get to my last two, but I've given you two easy ones.
That's why I was trying to keep it short. Yeah.
I know, but I've given you two easy ones. Now a more complex one.
Okay.
Constitutionally, who decides what's constitutional? And I want to go all the way back to your history, from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. And there's a current case, whether it's guns or abortion or affirmative action or, all the difficulty, interstate transportation or taxes. I mean, all the complexities of the human species, Americans, and how they conduct themselves. Who determines whether something's constitutional?
Anyone who knows how to read. But
wow, that's really interesting. So the guy that I forget his name, I don't want to know his name, the guy that took pictures of the secrets and put them on the interweb in his little game chat thing, and now all our adversaries and allies know what we're thinking, he can determine what's constitutional?
For himself, but not for anyone else.
Okay.
Who determines what is constitutional for everybody else is the Supreme Court.
Yeah, period. I mean, because they said so, it hasn't been changed.
Right. They are the final arbiter. But
and that can change, right? I mean, all of a sudden they get new appointees and they look at new cases, and all of a sudden they can do the exact opposite.
Right. But we sometimes act like, because the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what is constitutional, that we sometimes act like we don't have any responsibility towards maintaining the constitutional order. And I just want to make sure that Americans understand that you have an individual responsibility to maintain the constitutional order, even though you don't actually sit on the Supreme Court. So as part of
I love that, Jake. That's another great cut quote. Sorry to be interrupting you, Professor. That is a delightful statement. That's worthy of pondering. So the Constitution stuff is pretty easy. We see it on the internet all the time. Somebody says that's clearly unconstitutional, and that's somebody saying something, but that doesn't mean it's true. But it's okay that they're saying it, right?
Right.
Okay, cool. let's get to the last big one, and we're out of time. So forgive me, friends. Religion. How the hell do we know what the truth is? A lot of my more evangelical or conservative friends just go, this is easy, John. I can't even believe you're asking the question. Just go to the Bible. Is that the answer? Or some of my other friends go, you go to the Pope. And then some of my more honest friends in private go, well, not that Pope, the former Pope. So as far as religion goes, how do we know what the truth is?
Well, as far as my own individual faith, I would say if you're going to rely on the Bible, you have to actually read it. Because if you read it, and again, this comes into like, if you think you know what the truth is to such an extent that it is perfectly clear to you, I would say you're breaking the first commandment. And thus, my reading of the Bible tells me that the first commandment is to not put yourself in the place of God, because human beings are the first story of the Bible is the story of the flawed nature of man. And the biggest message of Christianity is how to accept forgiveness for your own flawed nature. So in each of these things, it keeps pointing back to humility rather than being strident. And
again, back to my earlier point on politics, is that a virtue in today's culture?
Certain.
So you're on the losing side, but you don't care.
Yeah. Well, I care, and I care because I wish, I want everybody to be happy and be nice. So I care. They'd be better drivers.
And we're out of time, so this is kind of unfair to throw in one. I was going to throw in two, but we really are out of time. The minister over my mother's, when she died 7 weeks and a day ago, she said something unusual that I don't necessarily agree with as the truth, but it never occurred to me. She said, not during the time with me, just in conversation in the environment, said there are as many religions as there are people. And I thought that was really interesting because I'm kind of a black and white guy. But she said that because everybody puts their own experiences and statements and knowledge and love and and they have their own interpretation and own level of thinking through it so far, that what they hear from the sermon or the reading is different than somebody else would see from the learning. And so it's all kind of on this. There's millions of religions, not like 5 dominants and then a bunch of other ones. And I thought that was just a really interesting perspective that has never occurred to me in 56 years until she said that. What's your reaction to that, her truth, by saying that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people often misunderstand about a life of faith is that faith requires doubt, because faith is a journey. If you have already arrived at the destination, you're not on a journey. And you have no doubts, right? We would use a different word. We wouldn't say faith. We would say certainty. And of course, everyone is bringing to any practice. You're always bringing yourself to and all of your experiences and thoughts to it. But I almost, again, I know there are problems because what you said is true. Everyone in the world disagrees with me a little bit about this, but how you experience faith is as an imperfect journey that you are committed to. But part of that is being committed to this path where from the outset, like, you don't get to know the answers to any of this. And another thing I've been thinking about actually on this point is when people from this other book I'm reading called Psych, we sometimes act like scientists and engineers, they have all the answers, and that somehow people in history and philosophy don't, that somehow STEM fields are different, but they aren't. Because every single thing that we call a science, everything we call technology, everything we call engineering, everything we call mathematics, eventually gets to a point where you have to say, and now we don't know anymore. This is all we know, right? And just because we get to that point at, in different studies, doesn't mean that these things are somehow materially different from one another, and that the engineer always gets to be right about everything, because every engineer gets to the point where they have to say, but why does that happen? And the engineer will tell you, I don't know, magic.
Yeah. So, Professor, I've got a short story on that, and then we'll open up the Q&A for another 5 or 10 minutes. I vividly remember this in high school, going through with my high school counselor about every potential occupation or major in college that leads to an occupation that doesn't require math or science. And so, because I was horrible at those. And he said, John, I think you're going to have to just go for political science or philosophy degree. And so I did, because I hate math and science. So as part of my philosophy minor, I think it was a junior or a senior, I finally took something called formal logic. God, theoretical math. I can't believe I led back to something I hate. Yeah. And I'm now having to do this for my minor, which supposedly people in like master's degrees do formal logic, because that's what mathematicians do. Yikes. I can't believe I reached back to that. It still pisses me off 35 years later. So thanks for that little story. A reaction to that, or shall we move on?
Well, we're pressed for time, so let's move on.
Good, thank you. Bart, Tony, or Jake? I took way too long. Oh, Tony, look at you. I'm looking at you online. You have a question or not? You were nodding at the professor. It wasn't me, I'm sure.
Well, I really appreciate that the book that he's going to write, and I think we'll have a festival around it too. In Visalia. It'll be a Visalia hippie, peace, love, and maybe some people can bring guns, just to keep it all balanced.
Oh God. Well, agreed. Hey Tony, were you the one that typed in his little that little nice compliment towards the professor?
Absolutely. What I realize is because the reason why I think AI is unfortunate in some ways is because I might be the last generation that was required to get to have some prereqs, because we got a liberal arts education, right? That was I had a BA, but it was a liberal arts college. So I was required to take, philosophy, psychology, and I went to a Jesuit institution. So I actually have a bachelor's degree plus 2 minors, one in philosophy and one in theology, if you were to look at it these days, so, but I think it teaches us to learn about how to think. And the thing that I loved about what the prof was getting at was, it's complex. And what it prepares us to do is to think complexly instead of just try to go black and white, because there's a bunch of gray. And it would be true, John, that, when we first met, you're like, man, you're a liberal. And I'm like, I guess I am. But then the more we talked, I'm like, I don't think I am, I don't think I actually qualify as whatever that is anymore. And find myself much more on a continuum.
In person, by the way, just as a nice critique, because I always ask for critiques, especially when it gets on the interweb. In person, I think you're a thoughtful, smart, generous person. But you present yourself online as some crazy, weird liberal. So I don't know why you do that, but for different strokes for different folks, Tony.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks. My point, though, is thanks for your shout out for a nice compliment for the professor. I just think that's authentic and true. Jake, what are we missing today? You are my religious mentor. You don't know that. You're half my age, I think. And we're different religions, but you're my religious mentor, my moral guidance. I know I'm being a little melodramatic, but there's a little truth to that. I think you're a really thoughtful guy, Jake. What did we miss today on truth? I bet you're a black and white guy. What did we miss? What don't you like what the professor said today?
Oh, I liked everything that Toodle said.
Man, I must have hit it out of the park today.
Yeah, you did well.
Uh,
But something that I think we need to always remember is truth, whether or not people believe it. Okay. So the fact that gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared, just because you don't like gravity, doesn't mean that you won't fall off a cliff when you walk off the edge.
Yeah, and even if Brackney doesn't like math, it's still gravity.
Yeah.
And this kind of came up when, like, back during the fall when I was teaching my students my US history class, we were talking about slavery and the start of the Civil War. And I was so fortunate to have our school's speech language pathologist sitting at my desk while I was teaching. And I'm talking about the conditions of slavery in the American South. I was showing pictures of enslaved persons. I was showing pictures of, scars on the backs of slaves that had been whipped. And I was talking about how even though the founders like Jefferson and Washington and Madison practiced slavery, they did not preach that it was a good institution, and they still believed in the axiom that all men are created equal. And so what the speech language pathologist did is she stood up and said, no, Thomas Jefferson is one of the most evil men who has ever walked the face of the earth. He was terrible to his slaves. He raped Sally Hemings, and I can't stand to hear this anymore. He did not believe that they were equal. Otherwise, he would not have done what he did. And then she stormed off and refused to listen to anything more I had to say to my class. But at the end of the day, in Jefferson's writings, he never says, I am better than the African, so therefore that's why I'm enslaving him. All of Jefferson's writings say, well, these are the laws of the land that we're living with. However, I want the new country that I helped create to improve and get better and leave behind slavery. And so even if you don't like the truth and you refuse to listen to it, it doesn't stop it from being true. And kind of like the Eisenhower quote that Toodle was mentioning about book burning, I put it in the chat, the full quote saying, like, the best way to combat people that do not believe in the truth is to study what they believe in and then learn from what perspective they're coming from, and then you can better interact with them. But I think kind of like in modern political discourse, we don't really care to look at the other person's side. We just say, oh, they're a Democrat, so therefore they're wrong. Oh, they're a Republican, so therefore they're wrong. But I mean, there are grains of truth within both of the political parties if we're willing to look for them.
Yeah. Jake, copy down your whole statement there, the last 2 or 3 minutes. Just copy that down. That's really worthwhile. Professor, are you still with us?
Yeah.
Professor?
Yeah. Sorry.
What
I mean-
Jake was talking about, no, it's all good. What Jake was talking about, I almost made the topic for today. It was kind of the underlying premise of what is the truth. I have a friend on Facebook who had 2 or 3 very long paragraphs about racism in America today. And I read it, and I read it twice, and I just asked a simple question. I said, who wrote this? And he goes, it's the history of the United States is the answer. I go, forgive me, I meant to be more precise. Is this your writing or is this a quote from someone else? And he goes, I wrote it and it's the truth. And it is a thoughtful, from one perspective, critique of white people, which I think is kind of racist, but we're in a racist society for the last 400 years. That's basically the summary of the 2 or 3 paragraphs. And we got to fight it every tooth and nail. We just have, and by the way, this is a person I know, and it's his page. So I decided not to engage, and he didn't ask. If he would have asked, I would have started to have a dialogue, but he didn't care, at least not yet. And that's why I kind of thought about having this broader conversation of what the truth is. For him, that's the truth. That we are in a racist society. He's a black gentleman and believes that that what Jake just said is not true. That all men are created equal is a farce. It meant men, not men and women. It meant white men, not any men. And it furthermore went white property owners, or wealthy people that had the ability to vote, and other people were excluded. But I didn't want to narrow. We'll have more conversations on race. So I'm sorry to ask, Jake, that was really interesting. But that's kind of the premise of why I'm trying to think through on how I engage with a person who I admire. He's thoughtful, he's smart, but he does believe that we're in a racist society, and the game is rigged against him. And so I'm trying to figure out how to make sure he has freedom and liberty and love and believes in the society as much as I do. And I don't know whether he will be able to get to that, or whether I need to change to get to that. So to finish out today's conversation on a really deep thing, it wasn't as deep as religion, but answer Jake or me or both of us in the last remaining minutes or two that we have.
Me or Bart?
You answer Jake or me.
Yes. Yeah. I don't even know where to begin. I guess when Jake was talking, I was remembering what we talked about last week, and I don't remember if it was when the cameras were on or off, but I think you made the point of like, will anybody ever believe us? And I said, oh no, of course not. And will this win an argument? The answer is no, absolutely not, because that's not how human beings change their mind. And I think one of us, or maybe both of us, made the point that if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, you've already lost, because most people are just kind of on label autopilot, and they go through life with label and stereotype autopilot. And there are good reasons why. It's efficient. It's efficient. It's not all of it's bad to live off of labels and stereotypes, but there are some definite downsides in that most of your life goes unexamined. And maybe there are some parts of life that really deserve a little further examination. As far as your friend goes, I usually think that if it's somebody who's completely unreasonable and there's no point in engaging them, I sometimes just say, well, best of luck on your journey, because there aren't enough hours in the days to disprove every single thing. But if it is somebody who seems serious, I usually just we'll say, well, let's take the first sentence and test that and see if it is made up of things that are true, accurate conclusions, and assertions that are falsifiable or provable, because sometimes they just contain non-falsifiable claims. This has been this way since blah, blah, blah. And you're like, well, if you're not willing to accept the historical record, then what you're making is a non-falsifiable claim, which means that under my sort of rules of evidence, you don't get to say what you say. Because you're just making stuff up. And in that sense, we should probably just disregard it. And I guess it relates back to my answer about what it is that I try to teach my students to do that AI can't do, which is I say, your job is to tell me what these documents say. And you must be able to interpret what this document says and make it shorter and turn it into a story that is an accurate representation of what is actually in these documents. You're here to learn that skill, because you're not, if you're a historian, you're not really supposed to say stuff if there's no proof of it, because otherwise you're just making stuff up, right? You're engaging in MSU, right, which can mean stuff or the other SH word, so that's fine if you want to make stuff up, but when you make stuff up, I'm going to put it into this different category of this is the part that's made up, and therefore it is of no value, and search through that to see if you've actually said something that isn't made up, that is of value that I need to deal with.
So, Professor, in 30 seconds or less, what Jake described with, I think he said a speech pathologist visitor to his classroom, who had such a vigorous disagreement with his statements to the class that she left, and I assume there's no ongoing relationship, or at least hasn't been resolved right now. He just articulated in the micro what's happening in macro in America, that 48% doesn't want to listen to 48, and maybe there's like 4% in the middle that are kind of trying to figure out why 96% of people hate each other. Maybe there are some thoughtful, rational people in the middle. Probably you. So there's one. But anyway, you're trying to think whether you're rational. Okay. Give us something to think about in coming days and weeks. How do we use truth effectively to maximize human freedom, or at least have peace in America? Give us something to hang on to, so we can engage in better dialogue and have a better life with each other.
I guess I'd say step one, maybe for most people, is if you want to have any kind of a constructive conversation, you need to come up with your own personal philosophy of evidence that you're willing to stick with. so that you can at least communicate that with someone else, so that they can help you work through answers. Because if you're not willing to commit to any sort of logical or moral philosophy of what you will accept as evidence, well, then there's almost no point in talking to you.
I think that's awesome. I think that's excellent. That's a good starting point. Maybe we'll have a whole conversation on that. Bart, I know I ignored you. Are you okay with that this week?
Yeah, I'm totally okay.
Okay. Ponder what you heard, though, because why don't you send me an email, because you always have something constructive. Sorry we didn't get to you.
No, it's okay.
Okay, cool. Professor, or Tony, Jake, anyone last words, or are we just going to have leave that with the professor for now?
I love his suggestion. I am not in any way speaking towards that. I actually think that's a good structure for personal love relationships plus historical whatever conversation we're having. It would be good to know what our definitions are. And I want to say outwardly, great appreciation to Jake for all of the running citations that he's giving. I've missed that so much, Jake. I really appreciate it. It adds depth to what we do. So thank you.
Yeah, totally agree. Gentlemen, thank you for this. Hope you have a great day. I got to go, and I know a couple of you are late as well. So have a wonderful day.